Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Is this better?
Yeah, that's no lag. Yeah, wow.
I really liked let's start with your post on sort of talking about the past versus the future. And I think it was really interesting. We've had both nostalgia politics certainly on the right with Make America Great Again, but also on the left too, right? And then you compared it to China. And I think it's interesting. Let's talk about sort of the role of nostalgia in politics and kind of how should we think about the balance between past and future and how sort of, what can we learn from China as well?
Right. So many people are hung up on this idea of having these great ancestors. And not just great, I mean, sometimes great individual ancestors, like my great great grandfather, did this amazing thing. Like my friend is. Anyway, but a lot of people are hung up on the idea of or very interested, let's say, in the idea of their collective greatness of their ancestors. So my ancestors built the pyramids, my ancestors built the Parthenon, my ancestors did this and that. And this motivates a lot of people. There's a lot of people in China who think like, oh, China was great for 5,000 years or whatever. So if I work hard, like I can build a great company. And if our country's on the up and up, like growth trajectory is going to be great because we have this great civilization that's restoring itself, you know, back to its 5,000 years of greatness, whatever. And so I think that it's very motivating for a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who think like, you know, my the group I'm a part of has done so many great things. Like there's some Jewish people who think like, wow, Jewish people won so many Nobel Prizes, like I could be a great chemist, or something like that. And then just this sort of and it's stolen valor in a sense. Like you didn't build that. You didn't build the pyramids, you didn't build the Parthenon, you didn't do any of this stuff. You're just some schlub. You didn't win any of those Nobel Prizes. Like if Einstein and Feynman were smart guys and you're Jewish too, that doesn't make you smart. What your own IQ and capabilities are. That doesn't actually raise your. But like I guess maybe people imagine that there's some kind of latent variable. There's some sort of like undiscovered greatness that like hasn't shown itself yet necessarily, but someday it definitely will because it must be there because my ancestors had it, or you know, like like I mean, how well you did on the SAT. You know how well you did on your college physics test or whatever. Like all these things, and how good you are at, like, I don't know, starting companies or whatever. Like you can sort of find out, but I guess we don't completely know. Like there's always some possibilities, like maybe I could be good at this thing that I've never tried. And so, or that I've tried only a little bit, or that I haven't finished trying yet or something. And so people, I think, get this sense of confidence from this idea of ancestral greatness. Like because people always are looking to not just de-risk things, but de-ambiguitize things. People don't want to feel like they're venturing into the complete unknown. And and yet that's what we're doing with modernity, right? Like we're in the complete unknown. Like if you look at China, the modern greatness of China is far, 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 far greater than the greatness of imperial China, of the Tang Dynasty or the Han Dynasty. It's like those people compared to modern people were just like absolute barbarians living on dirt floors and just like milking cows, whatever. Like they were not they had nothing to do with like what China's doing now with like building like AI and like robot factories and stuff like that. It's unprecedented. What China's doing now is unprecedented. What we're doing now is unprecedented. No one's ever been as great as us. Like it's not like, the 50s were better than now. They weren't. But, this idea of greatness motivates people in the present. And so that's basically what I was talking about. Sorry for the long rant there.
No. Rants are what Econ 102 is for. How do you think China and the US sort of think about the past versus future differently?
Well, that's interesting. So in China, there's definitely the sense of being the heir to this very, very long civilization, this old civilization. And there's this idea that this must make it Lindy. Lindy, the concept.
Yeah, of course.
Lindy means it's been around a long time, so it must be stable and resilient in some way. And there's a lot of things that the concept of Lindy doesn't work for. For example, aircraft. You wouldn't want to fly on an old aircraft, right? You want to fly on a new aircraft. And so, but then people think of like, oh, traditions are Lindy or whatever. So, but Chinese people, in some sense, they wouldn't probably use the term, think that their civilization is Lindy. It's been around a long time, and so therefore it was great before it could be great again. And I won't say all Chinese people think this, obviously, but then I would say that there are a significant number of Chinese people who think this, and for whom this is a motivating and inspiring idea. But the United States is different because the United States hasn't been around that long. So when you talk to people from the United States and you ask, why is the United States great? There's some people who will tell you that we were great 100 years ago. And when Trump says make America great again, he's talking about 100 years ago. That's what he's imagining. 100 years is different than 5,000 years. So it's still relatively young. And you get other people who talk about America's European heritage. You'll talk about the greatness of old Europe or the greatness of Greece, Rome, where, lots of people, like, that's one reason we had all these columns on all these buildings, is because people thought that we were, in some very real sense, the heir to Rome, the new Roman Empire. And so we're not. We're not like the Roman Empire very much. They were very different. That's a very different civilization, not just in a different location with different people, but also with different institutions and just, whatever. And I mean, frankly, we're a million times better than the Roman Empire was. And so Dwarkesh just did a really good podcast where he gets this guy to say, basically, the Roman Empire is technologically stagnant. They didn't have very good science, and that's why they never had an industrial revolution. That's probably right. America was always a very progressive country, hurtling into the future, powering forward the frontier of technology and science and what could be built. So we're just a very different country than the Roman Empire, but still a lot of Americans, I think, would derive this sort of sense of pride and personal inspiration from this notion that we're connected to the greatness of Rome.
Fascinating. Just while we're on the topic of sort of contrasting U.S. and China, more broadly, like in the last 10 to 15 years, last 20 years, have we converged more along with them? Are we becoming more like each other? In what ways are we not? How should we think about this?
I think so, actually. I think so. America has some traditional culture, obviously, because our ancestors came over with, like, German Christmas trees or like Hamburg steaks or whatever. We have these ancestral things. And, of course, we're a blend of various different cultures, but then, Americans are so out of context for those cultures. If you have people in Swedish villages, those villages have been existing for hundreds and hundreds of years, and sort of local people just kind of keep the culture going. In America, everyone's ancestors were displaced. And so we lost a lot of our ancestral culture. So a lot of America is just created new. And so we're like, okay, well, we don't have this ancestral culture to root us in these ancient traditions. What do we do? Instead, we buy things. We build new things. And so that's, people denigrate it as consumerism, consumer capitalism. But then I think in a very real sense, it's just modern culture. So we create, like, just all the, like, TV shows and movies and video games and all the consumerist pop culture, memes and internet sort of jokes, and all that stuff is very real, modern, new culture that we created new. And so I think that in China, you had this very old traditional culture that was, I mean, really thousands of years old. It really was. And so you had these farming villages where just people could trace their lineage back, even if half that was made up. But it was really what was true is that a lot of people had been sitting around in that same place for a long time doing kind of the same thing, farming, essentially, in old Chinese culture. And that was very old. And then you had the communists. And the communists were like, no, this culture is holding us back. We can't modernize. We can't resist the foreign powers, blah, 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 because of this backwards culture. And so they intentionally destroyed a lot of this culture. They destroyed a lot of what you now gets called Confucianism. I guess it was called Confucianism even then. And so, Confucian stuff, Taoist stuff, Buddhist stuff, and then Chinese traditional religion, which we, basically is paganism, which was very strong in China up until recently. And in fact, if you can still meet families of Chinese descent who do things that are connected to traditional Chinese paganism for their, like, weddings or like, whatever. And so but the communists were like, we got to destroy this so we can modernize, just smash it, smash it, smash it. And it was such a totalizing movement. Communism, especially Chinese communism, was just like a go door to door and make sure everybody does everything different kind of movement, right? This micro level of social control. And so they really wanted to smash this old culture, and Mao really wanted to do that. And so they didn't completely succeed, but they succeeded to a large degree. And what did they fill the void with? Well, then you had this era of rapid growth with Deng Xiaoping and his successors. You had this, like, you know, sort of 40 years really of rapid growth. Well, maybe 30 to 40 years of rapid growth. And then during that time, you had this consumer culture come up, and sort of that replaced traditional culture for a lot of Chinese people. So if you look at how Chinese people and American people live and sort of go about their daily lives and think about the world, it's actually very similar. So I think that China would be more similar to us than, say, Germany is, because Germany has this ancient traditional culture that America doesn't really have, except for like Christmas trees and some stuff, but like, we're not so similar to Germany, but we're similar to China because we both sort of got rid of our ancestral cultures and replaced it with like mass consumerism.
Fascinating. Speaking of consumerism, let's segue or pivot to sort of the tariff update. It looks like we haven't made a ton of progress in terms of getting these agreements. Are we still in perspective that these tariffs are going to sort of remain, and that's going to significantly impact the economy? What are your sort of predictions looking forward based on what we've seen so far?
Well, so we are not seeing deals being made, which that means that by, early July, the quote unquote Liberation Day tariffs are all going to come back. They're going to come back in force. That's going to be a much bigger shock than what we're seeing right now. So that's in the future. Unless something big changes, it looks like all those big Trump tariffs that he sort of backed off and got, put a pause on, are going to just come right back in July, unless something happens. And I can't tell you whether something will happen. But I will say that a lot of existing tariffs are now immediately causing a lot of existing disruption. So there's tariffs on China, which are pretty big. There's 10% tariffs across the board on everything. And then there's tariffs on specific sectors like autos. And some of the auto tariffs have been paused, but I think others haven't. So there's a lot of chaos out there. We can talk about the impact of uncertainty, but if you just talk about the impact of the tariffs themselves, we're starting to see, like, Temu and Shane and today Amazon putting, sort of a tariff surcharge notifier on some of their products. So we're already starting to see consumer prices go up, after tax prices.
And then, the question is regarding China, are we going to hold our posture and just sort of be at this detente with China and both suffer, hopefully them suffer more than us? Or are we going to sort of, do a deal or cave depending on your, on one's position on the tariffs?
Well, it looked, Trump made all these noises like he was preparing to cave, like he was saying, oh, I'm not going to play hardball with them, and we're going to ideally reduce the tariffs to like only 45%. And he made all these noises like he was going to concede. But China is hanging tough and saying, like, until America eliminates all tariffs on China, there will be no negotiations. And so if you look at, and in addition, they've put export controls on us for rare earth metals, which they're now attempting to enforce through Korea. They're saying Korea can't ship any products, is not allowed to ship any products to America containing Chinese rare earths. So basically trying to put an embargo on Korean electronics exports to America. We'll see how that shakes out. We don't know how that's going to work yet. I'll write about that and export control stuff. But then, so China is, fighting back pretty strongly, and container ship bookings from China are just falling off a cliff. It's like none of these container ships are being booked. Now, these container ships are really slow. They take, and they take a long time to like load, transit, unload, blah, blah, blah. But now, based on what we're seeing, 3 weeks from now, we're going to see a major decrease. And we're already seeing decreases, like the Port of Los Angeles, like I think traffic's down by 30% already. The Port of Seattle the other day was like empty. Like we're seeing empty ports already. And if you look at container ship bookings, then we're going to see more emptiness in 3 weeks from now. And we're already seeing trucking sort of falling off a cliff. So trucking sort of ordered bookings, like basically you make a reservation to move things on a truck. That's down to COVID levels. Like height of COVID. We're looking at like height of COVID shit. And, the Longshoremen Union, not the smaller one on the East Coast that notoriously supported Trump, but the other bigger one on the West Coast, is just screaming their heads off. They're like, tariffs are screwing us because these guys are going to be furloughed or maybe laid off. like, dock workers, longshoremen, truckers. And these are all working class men. And I would say more heavily weighted toward working class white men. But I know that doesn't matter anymore. This isn't the 2010s. Okay. So, but let's just say working class men who were Trump's strongest demographic is working class men. Right. These guys are getting absolutely hammered by these tariffs already, and it's going to only get worse. And so, like, Trump just hammered the livelihoods of his biggest constituency, and I don't think that they don't care. They just don't care. That's their ideology. Like Mao's biggest constituency were small farmers, right? And yet, who got hammered harder than small farmers in the Great Leap Forward? Nobody. Like Mao hammered his own supporters for ideological reasons. And then everybody got really hungry and poor and mad, and then he turned them all on each other with the Cultural Revolution, to sort of defray some of the anger from the Great Leap Forward. We're seeing Trump sort of already truckers. Sorry, I was going off on a tangent. But truckers and, dock workers are already seeing these negative effects today. But you're going to see warehouse workers see these negative effects when all the shipments stop coming, which they're already starting to stop coming. Like, it's a rolling thing. It gets worse every week. Like next week, we'll be talking about this again. We'll be talking about how bad it is, how much incrementally worse it is. But it's bad and it's going to get worse.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/102. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102. Every time I hop on the 101 freeway in SF, I look up at the various tech billboards and think, damn, turpentine should definitely be up there. And I bet I'm not alone. In a world of endless scrolling and ad blockers, sometimes the most powerful way to reach people is in the real world. That's where AdQuick comes in. The easiest way to book out-of-home ads, like billboards, vehicle wraps, and airport displays. The same way you would order an Uber. Started by Instacart alums, AdQuick was born from their own personal struggles to book and measure ad success. AdQuick's audience targeting, campaign management, and analytics bring the precision and efficiency of digital to the real world. Ready to get your brand the attention it deserves? Visit adquick.com today to start reaching your customers in the real world. Again, that's adquick.com. Is there a world where targeted tariffs would not hurt his constituency, the sort of working class, or is any tariffs basically going to be?
Well, no, I mean, I like targeted tariffs. If you said, okay, we're not going to allow China to sell us this product, this product, this product, this product, like that's what Biden did. It didn't do a damn thing. Like it didn't hurt because we said, okay, we're going to put a tariff on Chinese electric cars. It's really high tariff. And then, maybe American consumers are theoretically hurt because like maybe you would like to try a BYD car, but in practice, BYD didn't sell as many cars. And so we're like, okay, so we're never going to get this thing that we don't already have. So it doesn't really hurt anyone's existing livelihood. It doesn't cause losses from what we have today. And so then, or Chinese steel, like people say China makes all this steel and it's true, but we don't buy any of it. Like China doesn't make any of our steel. We buy our steel elsewhere. So yeah, if you put tariffs on like 10 Chinese products that, many of which we don't even buy many of already, like you're not going to see the livelihoods of the American blue collar men crushed. But if you put tariffs on like everything from China, you're going to see a lot of pain. And then if you put tariffs on everything from everybody, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, all these places, you're going to see just utter devastation. Like what you're seeing now with trucker bookings being down to like COVID levels, that's from part of the tariffs on China alone, plus 10% universal tariffs. plus uncertainty, policy uncertainty. Like already you're seeing this devastation from even a relatively low tariff on the world. Like 10% isn't that high. Like the dollar can theoretically move to compensate for that, although it's not doing that yet because of capital flight, but that's another story. But you're already seeing big pain from truckers and dock workers from just a small piece of the tariffs that Trump eventually wants to put on stuff. So like it's just going to get worse. But like, the productive capacity of countries like Europe and Korea and Japan and the other places like that, like I kind of do believe in that. I believe that they can produce things. And I think that I'm kind of bullish on Europe. I think that one thing we see historically is that when Europeans fight each other, they actually get serious. So like the Europeans are going to fight each other again, and this is going to make them build things. When Europeans don't fight each other, they kind of just sit around and goof off. But then when it's time to fight, they really, really build. And so I think that the fact that America's not protecting Europe from Russia anymore is going to make Europe get serious and build things.
Yeah. And so maybe to close this out, like if Trump called you up and said, "Hey, help me get out of this mess while also help me saving face," obviously this is a fantasy world, but what would you say? Like,
I'd say that narrow the scope of China tariffs. So if you can dramatically narrow the number of products that are subject to tariffs while keeping very high tariffs on a few things for the sake of appearances, and you can still say tariffs on China are 100% because look, we put tariffs on like these 10 things. So you can still say tariffs are really high, but in practice tariffs will be much lower. So do that. And the things that you should put tariffs on are final goods that are like high tech, any high tech final goods. And then so do that. And then, announce deals, quote unquote deals with like Europe and Japan and all these other countries so that Liberation Day tariffs never actually come back in July. And say, oh, we made a deal. Look at this. Art of the deal, guys. So I would do those two things. And China's not going to come make a deal with you, and you can say I stood firm against China, but in fact, so actually one interesting thing is that this is what China's doing to save face. So China put retaliatory tariffs of 125% on American goods, and then quietly realized this was stupid and incredibly narrowed the scope of the tariffs. So now Chinese 125% tariffs are only on a few American goods because they realize like, oh, this is going to kind of screw us because we're going to make our imported components more expensive. So China did that. So I would do that with Chinese goods. So just do the same face-saving thing that China just did. Like, it's funny. I recently heard someone say that the idea of saving face is a Chinese idea, but I had always thought of that as an American idea. Because, like, honestly, I think it's just equally important in both countries. You don't want to look weak,
right?
Like, it's the same. Another similarity between the two, right? And so, like,
and they're really sensitive to shame, right? The shame of the shame of being sort of Japan and stuff like this, right?
Right. But like saving face is like I have to prove that I was never wrong about anything. Like even Deng Xiaoping said Mao, he said Mao was 30% bad, 70% good. So like obviously face saving. Japan is different. Japan, people just like admit they're wrong over anything and then apologize and like, quit their job and then like get the same job again next week.
But I meant like, isn't China embarrassed about their history with Japan? It was sort of like embarrassed, like they want to return to glory or something. Like they have some historical shame over like sort of how they were treated.
I'm about that. I'm not really sure. We should get someone on to talk about that. But like, yeah, it's saving face. Saving face is about saying you were never wrong. Is about retroactively saying I was never wrong. I was always right to do this. I never made a mistake in the past. Rewriting history is like saving face, and I think Americans do this a lot, and I think China does this a lot too. And I think that Trump needs to do that, and China is doing that with the 125% tariffs. They're like, okay, actually, it's only on these few things. And so, like, Trump, that's what I would do if I were Trump. I would dramatically narrow the tariffs on China while keeping the tariffs on a few products the same, so I can claim that I never changed. Because most people are too out of the loop to really know whether it's like tariffs on like 5 things or tariffs on everything from China. Most people won't know the difference between that, and you can always just make a claim, and then like a couple of Washington Post economics reporters will say, well, actually, the effective tariff went down, and like 5 people will retweet that, and like no one will care, right? So like you can make that claim, and then you can And then you could cancel the Liberation Day tariffs and say, art of the deal, guys, art of the deal. And so, then do that. Like, that's what I would do to save face if I were Trump.
Yeah. And what do you say if someone was like, oh, but this is hurting China more than it's hurting us, and that's a good thing, and so we should be willing to take some short-term pain if they're going to take some bigger pain. This is actually Peter Thiel's argument that he said in a podcast.
Oh, but it's hurting us more than it's hurting China.
How do we measure that?
Oh, so we can look at the economic hit, like hit to growth. Employment, we can look at manufacturing, like whose manufacturing goes down worse. The fact is that there's this idea, everyone focuses on trade deficits and says that, China is more vulnerable than us because we have a trade deficit with them. But you can't just look at it bilaterally, because what China can do, so only, I think, 13% of China's exports officially go to us. Okay. And if you include value added components and materials and all those indirect exports, it's still lower than 20%. All China has to do to get around tariffs is find other buyers, domestic or foreign. Like, China can just, how Michael Pettis and all these guys have been saying China needs to increase domestic demand. Well, honestly, they can do that. They can say, hi, Chinese consumer, you've been stomped on for a long time, but now is your time to shine. Have a check. Here, buy a thing, buy a car, buy a TV. It's your lucky day, Chinese consumer. And China's consumption as a percent of its GDP is low. They can just raise that. They can just like give people money to buy the things they produce. And we call this the New Deal when we did it, and it worked. And then we had the 1950s and 60s where everyone's like, holy shit, I'm rich. I can have a car and a house and blah, 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 and one factory income with, going to work. China can do that. They can just bring in the Chinese 1950s. Okay, which is this massive consumer boom of domestic people consuming what they produce. And this was like, anyway, so they can do that. And they can also find new export markets that China can be like, hey, Brazil, heard you want a cheap car. Brazil's like, sure, I'll take a cheap car. I could use that, like driving through the streets of Rio in my cool Chinese cheap car. And then why not? And then they can go to Europe, and Europe is like, well, fuck America. You guys hate us. Europe, in some ways, I think the Trump administration hates Europe more than it hates anyone else. Like, more than it hates immigrants, more than, well, I don't know, that's neck and neck right there. But then certainly more than it hates China, I think they hate Europe above everybody else. They hate Europe because they think Europe are traitors to their heritage. They think Europe has betrayed Western civilization by letting in the Muslims and by embracing the, whatever culture, liberal culture, but like primarily by letting in the Muslims. You betrayed the heritage of the Crusaders, like Pope Urban would be so sad if he could see you now letting in these Muslims. And then, like, I think that's how JD certainly talks constantly when he talks about Europe. Trump hates Europe. Trump's people hate Europe.
Well, the hatred seems mutual, right?
Yes, the hatred is mutual. So Europe is going to take away tariffs on Chinese goods. Europe would be like, hey, we'll buy your cars. Build your factory here. We'll buy your cars. China would be like, okay. BYD factories mushroom up in Europe, and then Europe is driving all the Chinese cars. And guess what they're not driving? Tesla. Oops. So there goes, a third of Elon Musk sales or something like that. And so, like, that's what's going to happen. They'll sell to Europe. They'll sell to, other Asian countries. They'll sell to India. India will block their stuff, actually. But then they'll sell to Middle East, sell to Latin America. They'll sell to Southeast Asia, which is willing to buy literally anything China makes. Like, and those countries are growing, and America's not growing anymore. We're not growing at all. We're going to shrink now. And so, like, this idea that America, of course, Canada and Australia and all those places, they'll buy Chinese stuff. Like, America's not so irreplaceable. But the biggest thing that will replace America in terms of Chinese demand is the Chinese consumer themselves. They're going to buy the Chinese stuff. This is what America did. So America, instead, in the 1950s and 60s, yes, we had some exports. We exported like stuff to people, but mostly we built stuff for ourselves. And China can do that too. There's nothing stopping China from making cars for China. And they have a lot of people. They have 4 times as many people as we do, and they're poor. They could use a new car. They could use they already got all these new apartments that China built, all these massive amounts of new apartments. Well, now it's time for every Chinese person to have a car. Now it's time for every Chinese person to have a TV. Now it's time for every Chinese person to have like a AI-powered assistant in their home, which will also spy on them for the Communist Party, but they don't care because that's how they live anyway. Like, it's time for China to get like everything. Air fryers. That's the symbol of affluence in the modern day, is an air fryer. Every Chinese person get the newest, nicest phone. And, and service industries too. Like, China can provide service industries to its own people too. And so, like, all they need to do is get that flywheel of domestic demand going. Ultimately, China's exports are not that big compared to its economy. Like China's exports are like, I don't know, 15%, 17% of their economy, something like that. It's like, it's higher than us, but it's like lower than most countries because China's just so honking big. They sell stuff to China. China mostly sells stuff to China. Like, you look at all these car imports, China's become the top car importer in the world. But yet, if you look at Chinese car exports, you look at China, the car exporter, right? China's car exports are like the biggest in the world. If you look at Chinese car exports compared to like Chinese domestic car consumption, it's like tiny. Like, most Chinese cars are bought by Chinese people. And so, like, this idea that trade deficits are everything is wrong. They're a marginal thing. And we've gotten so used to looking at trade deficits and surpluses, these trade imbalances, that we forget about, well, first of all, we forget about like the vastly larger amount of like balanced trade that underlies that. But also we forget about just domestic stuff, which is just bigger. Like, these are not that open in terms of economies. China's economy is not, on the margin, maybe it was, relied on American demand, but on like overall total, it did not. Like, overall total, most of what China makes is for China. And that's always been true. And there was a brief time in the middle of the 2000s when their currency was very undervalued, when China's exports sort of became a very big part of their economy for like 5 years under Hu Jintao. And we over-index on that. We always think about that era because that was when American manufacturing employment crashed. That was the China shock. It was only lasted a few years. Okay, but that's not where we are now. That's not what the world looks like anymore. You look at what China's making, it's mostly for China. And the second China shock is simply overflow from the vast amount that China's producing for China. It's overcapacity. But anyway, so this is a long-winded way of saying that China's not that vulnerable to us. We are vulnerable to China not because of consumer products. Like, we can get all our cheap plastic doohickeys somewhere else. It's no problem, unless we tariff those places too. We're not vulnerable to that. What we're vulnerable to is imported components, because China spent the last 15 years doing something called the Made in China 2025 initiative, where they basically reduced their reliance on American imported components and machinery. They onshored that stuff, whereas we did not. And industrial policy, which the Biden administration was doing, was sort of the beginning of our equivalent, our weak, belated answer to Made in China 2025. We were going to become less vulnerable to China. Trump is not going to do that. Instead, he's just going to tariff the stuff. Unfortunately, tariffs are highly destructive, not constructive. They don't make factories appear. So China, for example, China makes like machine tools that we use to build things, like tool and die makers. Show me an American tool and die maker. You can't. Okay. But you used to be able to, in 1990s, you could find 1 million American tool and die makers. Now you don't find any because we just import those machines from China. What is going to create American tool and die machines? Machine makers. Where are those companies going to come from? Well, if we had a Biden administration approach, we could use industrial policy to sort of like build these new ones. But Trump's policy doesn't actually do that. What Trump does is Trump says you can't buy this from China, and just sort of hopes that this will result in all those tool and die makers suddenly rematerializing, but it won't. There's hysteresis, there's path dependence here. And those tool and die makers just don't appear. Well, you need industrial policy to rebuild them, to build a new tool and die industry in America. And we're not doing that. Instead, what's going to happen is that people are just going to do without a lot of the stuff that American tool and die makers would have made and that Chinese tool and die makers were making. Like, we're just going to do without the downstream stuff. So we're just going to be poorer. We're going to be poorer. That's going to be the result of the tariffs. Be poorer. Americans are going to be poorer people now. And I don't like that. And I think Americans don't like that. And that's why you see Trump's approval ratings crashing even before the real economic pain has completely hit. Like, you see approval ratings crashing I think you're going to see more. And we're going to really test this idea that Trump has this invincible approval floor of 35%.
I want to read a view that I heard sort of a right-wing person say, and I'm curious if you can assess. I know you're going to disagree with it. I'm curious if you can expose sort of the mistaken assumptions in the sort of sentence. So he's basically saying,
Let me hear.
yeah, someone was asking if he has the Navarronian view or Besanttian view on tariffs. And he says he has the Team Besant view, which is we're resetting the global system away from WTO and China towards a new compact between the US and our friends and trading partners. We're going to reset the system with the US in the lead and base the new order on conditions as they exist today, not in 1945, and with lessons learned from mistakes over the past 30 years, i.e., don't deindustrialize your country and outsource to your enemy. It's high stakes for sure and not easy and no guarantee. But if we accomplish it, then the 21st century will be another American century and we'll see innovation-led prosperity in the US again rather than the mirage created by financialization.
Okay, so my question is, how are you going to do that? Like, tariffs don't do that. Like, I believe that if you could have the credibility, so to do that, what you'd need would be, number one, you'd need the credibility to negotiate that new system. When we had the Bretton Woods system, that was a result of our negotiations with other countries. When we had the WTO system, which was similar in some ways to Bretton Woods, but I won't go into that, we did that by negotiating with other countries. When we were going to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we were going to do that by negotiating with other countries before Trump killed that. The thing that you're talking about now, we'd need to negotiate with other countries, but the other countries don't want to negotiate with us to do anything like this. Trump has antagonized and alienated Europe and our Asian trading partners and just everyone around the world. It's hard to say any country except Russia that has become more friendly to us because of Trump. So how are you going to do the thing that is described there? How are you going to make this international system without, when everyone hates you and doesn't want to play ball with you and your policies change every week and you just vilify and attack other countries and threaten them and bully them? And like, this is not how, who wants to be part of a system led by that shit? No one. Like, so first of all, to do that, you would need a totally different attitude toward the rest of the world that the Trump administration has utterly failed to demonstrate now. So are you hoping that a future Democratic administration will do this? Are you hoping that like Trump will just die of old age and JD Vance will come and do this? Like, who's going to do that? And how are they going to do that? And why will they totally shift from how we're behaving now toward the rest of the world? And why will that shift be credible? So that's my first question. So who's going to do that? The second is, in terms of reindustrialization, how are you going to do that? Because there's this seemingly faith-based belief that tariffs will cause American factories to sort of sprout up from the plains like mushrooms after the rain. But they don't. Like, tariffs don't reindustrialize you. They deindustrialize. Like, tariffs might be able to support specific sectors and support marginal industrialization of specific sectors if they're very targeted. But in general, if you just tariff everything, you're tariffing all the imported components. Like, look at US manufacturing. It's falling, like new orders are falling. CapEx is falling. Like, rapid deindustrialization is happening as a result of these tariffs. So if you want the kind of thing you're describing in the thing you just read, like, you'd need something to reindustrialize America that's, and tariffs are doing the exact opposite of that. So what's your policy to do that? Biden had this industrial policy. Trump has done, Trump wants to cancel even that. Trump wants to like kill the CHIPS Act, kill the IRA, kill all these things, and just replace it with nothing. It's like tariffs don't have the magical power to reindustrialize America. They instead are deindustrializing America. And so like, that's a simple, blunt fact. That's reality. We can see how much we manufacture. Okay, we can see new orders from manufacturers. They're falling off a cliff. We can see CapEx for manufacturers. It's decreasing and may soon fall off a cliff. We see, like, how are you going to how are you going to do any of these things described in that paragraph? Like, you can say those things. Those things sound good if, I can write down, like, we're going to do this and this and this, and it sounds nice, but how are you actually going to do it? It seems like all the approaches that Trump is doing seem to me to be absolutely antithetical to the goals just described in the thing you just read.
And are you very confident that it's not only hurting us more than it's hurting China now, but in the future that's going to be the case too? Like, there's no world in which it hurts them more than it hurts us.
I don't know, but like, I don't think that, I mean, look at what Europe is doing right now with regards to us and China. They're talking about dropping all tariffs on China. which they were putting up during the Biden administration. Now they're talking about dropping all the tariffs on China, right? And building all these, and having Chinese companies come in and build factories in Europe and sell all this stuff to China. Whereas Europe has promised to put reciprocal tariffs on us if the Liberation Day tariffs go through, and there's no hint of a deal. So like, I look at how that's working out. How's that working out? Like, it's going in exactly the wrong direction for all the stuff that was just described in that. Was that an email or a blog post that you just read to me?
That was a blog post.
A blog post. Okay. But yeah, so I'm just saying, like, if you look at what's actually happening on the ground, it's exactly the opposite of what's being described in that post. And not just Europe, but I could then say the same things for other countries too. But you know, Europe is just the biggest example here. And so like, Elon Musk came out and said, we need a full free trade zone with Europe. Okay, cool. Elon Musk did that, but is anyone in the Trump administration listening to Elon Musk? I don't think so. And like, I don't know. So I'll be honest, like, we both know all the people on like the tech right. Okay. I think that the tech right is living in a little bit of a fantasy world where they have these ideas for what American greatness could be like. And the Trump administration just isn't listening to them. The Trump administration is listening to Navarro and Lutnick and Steve Miller and all these people who fundamentally, you know, are a bunch of apparatchiks and cronies who, you know, who just, all they are is purely reactive and kicking against stuff they don't like Europe, trade deficits. They're just kicking. And the tech right people are sitting over there on the West Coast, dreaming these big dreams about an American-led, you know, sort of new industrial order and a free trade zone with Europe, and, you know, and all these big dreams, you know, build a bunch of nuclear plants. Like, you see, like Sean McGuire, he's saying we need all these nuclear plants in America. Well, sure, okay, we need all these nuclear plants, but what did Trump just do? Trump gutted the Department of Energy's loan program office, which is the thing you need to build nuclear plants. That's how nuclear plants get financed. And no one's like, are you going to like do a Series A for a nuclear plant? No. Like, you need massive government-based loan financing for nuclear plants. That's how China does it. That's how France did it. That's how every country in the world does it. And that's how we've always done it. And yet, you know, big government guarantees for underwriting the loans of GM and Westinghouse so that everyone feels safe lending to GM and Westinghouse. That's how you build nuclear plants. Okay. But we're not doing it. We're doing the exact opposite. We just gutted the loan programs office, and nuclear like loans and plans and all this stuff, which was not really undergoing a renaissance, but there were a few plans in the work, let's say, that's all ground to a halt. Like, the tech right people are living in a fantasy world. And just because, you know, you get together and say, like, you know, you can post like big American flags and say, like, we're going to make America great, we're going to have a free trade zone with Europe, and we're going to build 1 million nuclear plants. But then the Trump administration is doing the exact opposite. Like, the Trump administration is not listening to the tech right. They're just living in a fantasy world on the West Coast. And like, you know, maybe your crypto will go up, or some of your crypto will go up, and like, you can think, okay, well, I made out with a little bag of gold anyways. But ultimately, none of the things that these people are talking about, these big grand plans they're talking about, are actually in the works. And and all the stuff that the Trump administration is actually doing is exactly antithetical to these big dreams.
I think, going back to an earlier point, but related, I think we've sort of taken our relationship with Europe for granted, in the sense, I think there was this idea that we had a lot of room to negotiate because there's no way that they would sort of, you know, become allies with China or something, because China is also antithetical to their values and everything they hold dear. Do you think this is an actual real threat? Like, do you think Europe would sort of partner with China and in trade or more broadly?
Of course, 100%. 100%. They will try to partner with China. China won't be as good a partner as we used to be, but China will be a better partner than we are now. And see, Europe's threat is Russia. China says they have a friendship with Russia, but in practice, they don't help Russia that much. But, you know, they sit there and they buy Russian oil, but they buy it at a deep discount that sort of gouges the Russians. All right. And they don't, you know, they'll make some drones for the Russians, but they'll make drones for the Ukrainians too. They're making drones for both sides. You know, and they're not making artillery shells for Russia. They're not sending guys to fight in Russia. I think there were a couple of Chinese mercenaries that popped up, but like, China's government is not supporting. But Europe wants to keep it that way. Europe can't fight against China and Russia together. They just lose. But they can beat Russia as long as China doesn't help Russia. So they want to keep Russia in their or China in their corner as much as they can, or neutral. They want to keep China neutral so that China doesn't jump in on the side of Russia and fuck them up and conquer Europe, like, because a China-supported Russia could conquer all of Europe. A non-China supported Russia can't do shit. Like, you can sabotage some stuff and like take over some border territories. But like a China supported Russia could stomp. If you had the manufacturing might of China, and like if China sent soldiers to fight with Russia, like they could stomp Europe. And so Europe knows this. And Trump has already unilaterally, spontaneously defected from Europe and become allies with Russia. Okay. And all the people we know on the tech right have talked themselves into being Russia lovers when, 10 years ago, they would have despised Russia legitimately. And now they've all talked themselves into thinking that Ukraine is so horrible and evil and Russia's great. And yet, this is the attitude that has driven Europe away. This attitude and the attitude of the people on the right who want to punish Europe for letting in the Muslims. They want to punish Europe for letting in the Muslims, and they want to ally with Russia, for like standing up for Western civilization and, whatever. Like Russia stands strong for Western civilization while Europe are these corrupt, fallen individual blah, blah, blahs. And so that attitude has just unilaterally driven Europe away, and it will drive Europe into the arms of China, even though China is not, it doesn't share European values. Sure. It's not the best partner, but like, if you look at Europe's history, they partnered with the Ottoman Empire to block Russian conquest. Okay. And the Ottoman Empire had tried to conquer bits of Europe, certainly, in the Balkans and Austria, right? They tried to conquer parts of Europe, and if they could have, they would have conquered all of Europe. But then, so they were obviously, and obviously the Ottoman Empire didn't share many values with Europe in the early modern period. Like, they were Islamic, they were despotic, all this stuff. They didn't share these values, but Europe gladly, and when I say Europe, I mean like France and all these other countries, partnered with the Ottomans to balance out the Russians. Okay. And they'll do the same with China today. That's what Europe does. Europe knows how to balance the external powers against each other. And so Europe will do this. We were Europe's great protector until Trump got in office. And now we're not. Now we hate Europe and are trying to punish Europe for letting in the Muslims. And instead, we're trying to support Russia. And like all the, Tucker Carlson is just like a Russian propagandist. And, David Sachs loves Russia. And like, just always is saying, Russia's our friend. Like, well, no, it's not. But even abstracting that, when you say that, what does Europe think? Europe reads David Sachs's Twitter account, and Europe is saying, oh, Trump guy, Russia's our friend. Russia's America's friend now. And so Russia is, Russia's Europe's enemy. China is not. China is simply, a distant power. And America has chosen to make itself Europe's enemy by allying with Russia. And we're driving Europe away by allying with Russia. We've become Russia's best friend, and we just suck up to them constantly. Vladimir, stop. We're just like Trump just begging Vladimir Putin. Like, Russia's this like crappy, militaristic, medium-sized barbarian country with a lot of oil. And Trump is just on his knees, sucking up to the despot of this mediocre country. All right. I won't say Russia's like nothing. It's not, but like it's a medium-sized, mediocre, barbarian, militaristic nation. And Trump is just absolutely sucking up to them. And Europe can see that. That has driven Europe away from America into the arms of China. And that's not going to change. And that plus like Liberation Day tariffs on Europe, like every single thing we do is just like kicking Europe, kicking them in the face. And the idea is eventually they'll come crawling back to us because they're our colony. Europe is our satellite state. Europe is our like, they're our like little bitch, but they're not. They're not. Okay. And they will gladly partner with China. And like I've actually heard people in the tech industry talk about Europe as being like our satellite states, like Germany and France and Britain as being like our satellites. Well, they're not. And we're going to learn that they're not. Europe is more united than it's been in its entire history. And that was to fight the Russians. And now it's to fight the Russians and the Russians' new buddy, the Americans. We have effected a realignment where our only ally is Russia. America's only ally now is Russia. That is disastrous because Russia produces nothing except oil and like some artillery shells. Like Russia produces nothing. They are a medium-sized, like militaristic barbarian power. And that's our only ally and friend in the world now. That's our only friend in the world. That was stupid. And people in the tech right supported that shift wholeheartedly. And that was stupid. That was very stupid. And it's very difficult to get people to realize they were stupid and change tactic because of saving face, cognitive dissonance, and stuff like that. But I am under no such constraint. I always thought this was stupid. So I'm just saying, sorry, guys, this failed. This is what happens when you make Russia your only friend.
Yeah. Well, to the extent that is the outcome or becomes the outcome, I agree that's a absolutely disastrous outcome. So hopefully there's still time remaining and, sort of fences can be mended, et cetera, et cetera. But
can I rant a little bit more here? When you see like guys on the hard right, the alt-right, who thinks like white people in Western civilization, like that's the core thing that makes the world great. And white people need to stick together. Why do we fight our white brothers in the Civil War? Why do we fight our white brothers in World War II? We should have all stuck together. Well, now we see why you did that. Okay. Because the reason we fight our white brothers, okay, is because you're just contentious because the right fights other white people. That's who the right fights. Like Hitler. Why did Hitler lose and die and just, go down in flames and end the era of German greatness forever? Like, why did that happen? Because he invaded the Soviet Union. Right? Because he invaded the Soviet Union. He fought white and fought Britain. Hitler spent all his time killing white people. Hitler killed 25 million white people. Okay. Even if you say Jews aren't white, Hitler killed 25 million white people, non-Jewish white people. All right. If you add Jews, he killed 30 million. And so, I mean, like we came up with this idea that the Holocaust, quote unquote, was different than all the other genocides that Hitler was doing on just like regular Slavic folk and, like just rando white people. Like we came up with the idea that these were two different genocides. Hitler just thought it was all of a piece. It's all part of Generalplan Ost. It's like, or however you pronounce that. Like, I don't pronounce German, sorry, because we won the war. And then but whatever this plan was that they just, like, Hitler was the champion of white genocide. And Confederacy versus Union. The Confederacy was shooting all the white Union soldiers. They fired on Fort Sumter, bro. Like, the right always fights white people, and they're doing it again, man. They're fighting the Europeans. The white alt-right supremacist guys hate Europe more than they hate anybody else. They hate the white people first and foremost because they always hate the like race traitors or internal enemies more than they hate like, some random guys from like Egypt.
Isn't that true more broadly too? Like, people in the Middle East fight each other, sort of
Yes.
from Africa fight each other,
Yes. Like, look at who China has killed over the centuries. It's almost entirely Chinese people. Look at who Middle Easterners fight. And like during the like Muslim era, there were absolute vicious genocidal wars between Muslim emirates, like Tamerlane or whatever would just like build mountains of Muslim skulls. And then he was like, I am the defender of the faith, the defender of Islam. Look at the Crusades. The Crusades did a little damage to like the Turks, but then mostly this Crusade sacked Constantinople. Like the Crusaders destroyed the Byzantine Empire by sacking Constantinople. They were like, we'll just fight some Christians this week. It's yes, everybody fights their own. And as my sister puts it, bitches fight for niches.
That's great.
That's what she always says.
Let's end on that because I'm 11. I got to catch this flight, but this is a great episode. As always, until next time.
Thanks, man. All right, until next time.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and eriktorenberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.